Hi, welcome to Jewish Culture and Jewish Awareness. My name is Dustin Hausner. I am the Jewish Outreach and Program Director at the Wayne YMCA. All our Jewish programming is funded through the Jewish-Federation of Northern New Jersey. Today we have a wonderful guest that I'm excited to talk to because she wrote, I think, a very thought-provoking book, and it talks about a very interesting relationship in Judaism with Buddhism, which I'm going to wait for the author to go into in a few moments. But just to introduce our author, um, Emily Sigalow is a sociologist of contemporary Jewish life who focuses in particular on the American Jewish community. She has held various academic positions at Brandeis University, Duke University, and Wesleyan University. Emily serves as the executive director at the UJA-Federation of New York, where she directs the research, evaluation, and measurement department. Emily recently finished a book project about the historical and contemporary encounter between Judaism and Buddhism in America, which is what we're about to discuss. The book, American JewBu, Jews, Buddhists, and Religious Change, explains how Judaism and Buddhism met, combined, and changed in relation to each other in America since 1893. So Emily, thank you so much for joining us today and for writing such a very interesting topic and book.
Thank you, Dustin. I'm really happy to be here with you.
No, it's an absolute pleasure to have you. So let's start with something very simple. So the term JewBu, it sounds straightforward for some people. For some people, it's a very confusing terminology. What do you define as a JewBu?
So a JewBu is really a portmanteau of, it's a mashup of two words, Jewish and Buddhist. And when I came to this book project, I thought the JewBus were a thing, a monolith, a single group. But in fact, there are subtypes of JewBus. There's variety in how people engage with Judaism and Buddhism, which after finding, after doing the research, it seems like, of course there are different ways that people are Jewish and Buddhist, but a JewBu, in the way that I use it, is just somebody who holds a meaningful relationship with Judaism and Buddhism. And even though that there's different ways that those relationships are shaped for different groups of people, the umbrella category is just somebody who has a relationship with both of those traditions.
So let me ask, because in the book, you are specific in talking about kind of three subgroups of what a JewBu is, which I think is interesting because, as you just were mentioning, some people identify a JewBu as someone who's Jewish who follows Buddhism. Some find it as someone who's Buddhist who has a Jewish background. So it's a couple of different things. But you have three very specific groups that you have for what a JewBu is, or at least in your research. Would you mind talking a little bit about that?
Sure. So when I came to the project, I thought that there was one group of JewBus and that they more or less were the same. And then what I found, which was really interesting, was that there were different types of the ways that people engage with Judaism and Buddhism. So and of course, whenever you group people together, groups are always rough, right? They're not perfect. There's people that are somewhere in between these groupings, and they're not impermeable circles, but they do kind of different subtypes or groupings do help explain different relationships. So there's one group that's a group of JewBus who are people who were for whom Judaism was their primary meaning-making system. Judaism was their primary religion, their tradition, their holidays. It was their primary practice. It was their community. And for many in this group, they were observant, practicing Jews. And this group of Jews also had a relationship with Buddhism that was primarily focused on practice. They would have these were people who saw themselves as Jews, but who also had a Buddhist practice.
Hmm.
And largely their practice was a meditation practice. So they would go to various Buddhist centers or maybe go on a Buddhist retreat to cultivate that practice. But for them, they were primarily first and foremost Jews who had this practice. There was a second group of JewBus that came out of the research were people who were, I would say, primarily Buddhist, for people for whom Buddhism was their primary meaning-making system. It was their Buddhist center was their community. Buddhism was their practice. It was also their framework for meaning-making. It was their philosophy. It was their teachings. But for these Jewish Buddhists, these JewBus. Judaism was their culture and their heritage, where they came from. It was their family tradition. And they identified primarily as Buddhist, but they also identified as being Jewish, because Jewish was also a part of who they are, where they came from, and part of their identity. And so even if it wasn't their current way in which they expressed, their practice. And then and this was the smallest group. So there's group 1, group 2, group 3. Group 3 were people who really felt that they were both. That Judaism and Buddhism were their practice, that they had Jewish practices and Jewish observances and Buddhist practices and Buddhist observances, and that both the communities were their communities. They belonged to the Jewish, to their Jewish synagogues, and to maybe other Jewish organizations, and similarly belonged to Buddhist meditation centers or other Buddhist organizations, and for whom both Judaism and Buddhism kind of served as their framework for meaning making. And these were people who really saw themselves as truly both. And I would say that was the smallest group of those who I interviewed, were those people who really were the boths.
Interesting. So let me reach more specifically in regards to what are the reasons that you believe that Jews have been attracted to Buddhism. I know in your book you mentioned 4 categories that you have said, like historical reasons, religious and theoretical, demographic, and I believe pull explanations. But I'm curious for the average person, because I think many people see just very different philosophies in Judaism and Buddhism. So what do you believe is the attraction for many Jews to Buddhism?
First, I just want to offer a disclaimer that I think this is a really hard question to answer. And the study that I did was in ethnography. So I did a lot of interviews and I talked to people, but by nature of the type of research that I did, the ethnographic research,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not able to show causality.
Singular.
Right. To say or to prove even correlation, that this is what leads to that. I can't say that. What I could say, based on the interviews that I did and the conversations that I had, was what I saw, what I interpreted as the reasons. And I think that they were complicated reasons. And then there were historical reasons about the relationship between Judaism and Buddhism historically in the United States, which means that it's been largely neutral in the United States, as opposed to, let's say, Judaism and Christianity, which has a fraught and complicated history, not just in the United States, globally, particularly in Europe. But Judaism and Buddhism don't have that relationship with each other. So I think many American Jews felt much more comfortable or at ease exploring Buddhism in that respect. There were certainly very strong demographic explanations for the Jewish interest in Buddhism. Buddhism tends to appeal to people who live in urban contexts, who are highly educated, tend to be upper middle class. I'll say white, although not necessarily. This is for Buddhism that is a convert Buddhism that is particularly geared towards a more white audience, although it's not necessarily all white now. There's many other people of color, but I'm comparing that to like an Asian Buddhist temple, which certainly has a largely Asian membership base. But in these more American Buddhist centers, that pull these urban, educated, more upper middle class practitioners, they tend to pull a lot of Jews, and Jews are overrepresented in that segment of American society, the urban, the highly educated, etc. So it's like, birds of a feather flock together. And I think that that's a strong explanation for why there's so much, why you see so much Jewish interest in Buddhism. And I think that there's other explanations that are both, spiritual and religious too, that American Jews are finding something in Buddhism that they're not finding in other traditions, that they're able to think about it, that it's very practice oriented, especially meditation. And that's very compelling to many. And for others, it offers a completely different philosophical system, Buddhism. And that in and of itself is compelling in a contrast to Judaism and other Abrahamic religions. So again, I think the explanations are quite complicated, and there are many, and it's all of these things kind of tied up together.
So I certainly want to go back to like things like meditation and stuff a little bit later, but in your book you go through periods of Jewish and Buddhist engagement in the United States. That's a good chunk of the book. And I'm curious, what do you think have been the most significant interactions or leaders to bridge the two communities? Just because it always seems like when like movements come together, there's always like some sort of significant event, or like this person met this person and that led to. So I'm curious if through your research, if there were significant either events or individuals meeting that helped in those moments of bridging the two faiths.
Um, so I think that there were more events that began. We can kind of think about specific encounters as an encounter that began in the post-war period, that kind of punctuated the relationship between those traditions. Prior to the 50s and 60s, the encounter between Judaism and Buddhism was really centered on individual Jewish encounters with Buddhism, and which isn't to say that those individuals didn't have um, a real influence on Buddhism in various different ways. I unearthed some of that in the book and go through those different figures, and each of these figures I think was very important in his or her, mostly his, time period, from 1893 forward, and starting with Charles T. Strauss, who was the first person to convert to Buddhism on American soil, and also happened to be Jewish, and was um, an important Buddhist modernizer, and had an influence on Buddhism both here in the United States and in later in Europe. So there were these. I don't know if they were moments, but they were people, and there's these Jewish people who had an important relationship with Buddhism and an important influence on Buddhism in their own particular time periods. But beginning in the 60s, I would say they really were. It was less. I think the story was maybe less about a person and more about a moment and moments. And there were these moments that happened moving forward that really brought Judaism and Buddhism together. There was moments of dialogue. Um, Not, the most famous of which was the encounter that Roger Kamenetz describes in his book, The Jew and the Lotus, with American Jews going over to Asia, meeting the Dalai Lama, etc. And there were these moments, and there are these moments of encounter, and there are these moments of exchange, and beginning, really, even fast forwarding through the 80s into the 90s, these encounters began to pick up in terms of frequency and intensity, and they led to a much more almost deliberate mixing of the two religions. And one of the offshoots of that, at least a clear offshoot of that, was the rise of the movement for Jewish meditation, which I talk about more in the book, but to me was one of the most fascinating stories that came out, was how this movement started as a direct offshoot of the encounter between Judaism and Buddhism, and now how it's become such a popular movement in the United States.
Well, actually, that's a perfect segue to the next question I was going to ask you. So there you go. But I was going to say, specifically in areas of like meditation and mindfulness, over the years, there's been many Jewish groups that have focused on the Jewish lenses and Jewish practices of these two methods that are very popular in Buddhism. Do you feel that Buddhism's popularization of these two practices led to Jews adopting them and making it their own, or do you think it caused Jews to discover that historically they have had their own version of these methods, like through Kabbalah and such? So I'm curious if you feel, due to the popularity, Jews have adopted it and put a Jewish spin on it, or has it led to more searching, like, hey, we have our own version of it, goodness knows how long ago, and we've decided to resurface it now because it's a popular thing to do now?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's both. It's both of those things. Um, and so Buddhism in the United States, not all of Buddhism, but a lot of various Buddhist practices, particularly meditation, have been deeply secularized in the really, it's in the global context,
Mm.
and not just secularized, but also medicalized. So when we think of meditation for many people doesn't even it doesn't even seem necessarily Buddhist. It seems potentially more therapeutic. There's the mindfulness-based stress reduction clinics that began in Massachusetts at the University of Massachusetts hospitals, or UMass Medical Center, and and that MSBR movement really was a movement to popularize meditation and bring it to the masses of America, and branded in really medical, clinical, secular terms. And I think many Jewish people still think about Buddhism as being a stress reduction technique, as being a therapeutic technique, and don't feel any discomfort with their meditation practice as a result of that. I think the movement to bring meditation into Judaism, or at least for Jewish people to meditate more frequently, also sparked a kind of a return to our own roots movement, right? There was like, well, you don't, there was a counter reaction to, well, you don't, among many Jewish leaders, well, you don't need to look outside of Judaism to find meditation. We have meditation on our own, within our own tradition. Just look inside, don't look outside. And so many Jewish leaders kind of began to unearth some of these more Kabbalistic and mystical meditative traditions that indeed are, historically part of, or at least historically have a part of Jewish practice.
Mm-hmm.
And unearthed them. There are many more books that were written about Jewish meditation and Jewish, mystical meditative practices beginning in the 70s, as a direct reaction to the fact that so many Jews were going outside of Judaism to find this, to meditate. Mm-hmm. And so many, rabbis and leaders said, no, look here first. But even if, and it is true that Judaism certainly has its own mystical meditative practices, but those practices are not the same as Buddhist practices. And I think that many people who participate in Jewish meditation maybe think about what they're doing as an extension of some traditional Jewish practice, but traditional Jewish practice never looked like a sitting meditation on a Buddhist cushion, right, in a circle, cross-legged, with a focus on the breath. That is a Buddhist form that has been oftentimes brought into Judaism, but it would be untrue to say that form in and of itself is historically Jewish, although there are other historically Jewish meditative forms.
No, I very much appreciate you talking about a little bit about the distinction, and just kind of, it's interesting to think about in the sense you said, and we'll talk a little bit more about that shortly, of kind of the reaction and why it's been so profound, especially in the last couple of decades, of how open it's been in many ways. But going to kind of Judaism and Buddhism as two different, obviously, religions and faiths, these two questions are kind of obvious ones, but I think they are interesting and important. Is, what do you find are the most common similarities between the two religions that have allowed people to identify as both JewBus without feeling that contradiction of, being one or the other? Like, do you feel that there are similarities that have helped with that identity?
That's a good question. Similarities. I think that both. I think that they're similar in the respect that they're not for each other, that they're not Christian. And so that there's something that feels safe, like a safer space, at least for Jews. I think the fact that that embracing another minority religion feels like a safer embrace than embracing the majority right now. And I think that there is something to be said for the way that Judaism and Buddhism have been secularized in the United States, that has led to certainly to the way in which many people kind of embrace their Jewish and Buddhist blended religious practices. And for many people, Judaism is, like I said, is their culture, is their history, is their people. It's not necessarily their religion. And I think that speaks to the way that Judaism has really been transformed in the United States. That for many people it can exist like that, and because it can exist like that for so many people, then adopting a different um, a different religion's practice doesn't feel like it is at odds at all. It's one thing is a culture, a history of people, a background, and then the other thing is a practice, and they for many people feel like they go very well together.
So the obvious counter question, of course, would be, what do you find are the most significant differences that many feel that being JewBu is anti-Jewish? The thing that I've heard the most common is the question of idol worshiping has been one that I've heard quite a lot. Is obviously it's against in Judaism and in Buddhism, while they don't, to my understanding, pray to the Buddha as a god, because his whole philosophy was that he was human. But they use idols of Buddha all the time, and they'd use it as part of the prayer. So I'm curious for you, what have you seen as the differences that have led many to feel that being a JewBu is negative to an extent?
Well, I think that there's a lot of pronounced differences in terms of the theology, the worldview, um, and in terms of the practices too, between the two traditions. They're very different traditions. I would argue more different than the same. But in terms of, I think of what makes these differences problematic for many people is precisely what you just picked up on, is the Buddha imagery. I think there are specific prohibitions within Judaism against idol worship and idol imagery. And so for many practicing Jews, the Buddha imagery makes them very uncomfortable. There's a lot of bowing in Buddhism, and I think bowing as a practice makes many Jews uncomfortable, again, with a Jewish prohibition against, bowing before their gods or other people, like a prohibition against bowing in general. So that is uncomfortable, and there are various uncomfortable things that that a practicing observant Jew would see in Buddhism. For the most part, when Judaism and Buddhism, I'll say, get mashed up into Jewish meditation,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of those uncomfortable and those discomforts
Mm-hmm.
get shed. So if one were to go to a Jewish meditation class, you would not see any Buddha imagery.
Right.
You're not going to see a little Buddha statue. I mean, for the most part, I have not seen one. I can't say universally, but I've gone to many, or at least had gone to many Jewish meditation centers that had never seen, any Buddha imagery, and there's I don't think I ever saw any bowing either. So there was, these aspects of Buddhism that were uncomfortable to Jews got shed in the mashup process. And so Jewish meditation looks much more like a practice of breath awareness than it does anything else.
So as you mentioned earlier, and also it's in the very beginning of your book, actually, as you talk about like the Jew and the Lotus, when that came out, and how that kind of changed a lot of thoughts on the subject. And then, these days there are not a ton of books, but there are quite a few books about people writing about being Jewish and Buddhist. And, if you look online, you find quite a number of practicing practitioners with Jewish backgrounds. So I'm curious why you think in the last couple of decades, particularly, I mean, you mentioned the 50s and 60s as a big boom for a lot of different reasons. But I'm curious why now you think that it's resonated in Jewish culture to have this identity of, being a JewBu, but also, being more open to talking about it, because there are certainly things in Jewish culture that usually kind of get pushed aside, but this one seems to be much more comfortable to be talked about in public spaces. So I'm curious your thoughts.
So my view is that this question is less of a Jewish story and much more of a Buddhist story, meaning that, what is the reason that there's so much more, Jewish interest in Buddhism right now is because this is when Jews are a lot like the non-Jews, that there's much more interest in Buddhism right now in general, right? That there's been an explosion of interest in Buddhism since the 70s in the United States. And that has really only it really has grown over the past 4 decades. And again, this is in part to this wasn't unintentional. There were intentional efforts to popularize and secularize Buddhism in the United States and to kind of bring it to the masses. And as more Americans in general took interest in Buddhism and began to find it as, as a both a very therapeutic practice, also a very meaningful practice for them. American Jews, not dislike their neighbors, also began taking interest in Buddhism. So in this sense, I think this is just about Jews being just like everyone else. And I think the reason for the popularity of, or for the comfort around the identification, right? That people can walk around and say, yeah, I'm a JewBu, and their neighbor might just shrug and say, oh, that's great. And that without, people feeling free to identify as such, and having this not be a contentious identity, is again due to the fact that Buddhism itself has become much, much more accepted in the United States. And it's not just JewBus or Christabus. There are a lot of people who are part Buddhist and something else, and Christian, Catholic, Muslim probably too. And so, and I think that there's just been a broader national acceptance of Buddhism, and as such, there's been a larger Jewish acceptance of it as well.
Do you feel, and from what I've been able to tell, being a JewBu is very much individualized as a concept for the most part. It's not like another sect of Judaism. It's not like I've heard of, people going to the JewBu synagogue or anything like that, or like a Jews for Jesus, or like, in other words, it seems very much a very individualistic identity, not so much something that is trying to be like an offshoot of Judaism. I wanted to see if because of that, do you think that's a reason why there is such growth in people maybe associating with you, because it is such an individualized identity versus necessarily being part of a larger sect or movement within Judaism, if that makes sense?
Yes. I mean, I think it is largely individual, an individual identity. There isn't a lot of institutional, there isn't a movement for being Jewish Buddhist, right, around it. There isn't a central body that says this is what this is. It's a codified hybrid or religion of sorts, and this is what's in and this is what's out. And there isn't a Jewish Buddhist Torah, so to speak, and there isn't a Jewish Buddhist worship center or any umbrella organization. So there's no institutional infrastructure that makes this a formal movement. And I think it is largely, how people's individual practice. That said, I think that if somebody were to try to find somebody who is a JewBu, there are places that you could find them. I would go to a Jewish meditation center would be a pretty natural place. So there are some institutional meeting points, hubs.
Yeah.
Right? That people come and congregate and look for like-minded others, people who also are bringing together the kind of the same similar traditions and backgrounds. So in that respect, there's something institutional about it, even if it's not the defining feature of the group.
So for someone who has listened to this whole thing, is curious about the subject matter, but has never thought about JewBu, for them this is a brand new concept, maybe goes into a store and sees your book for the very first time, what is the reason you feel that Jews should not only read your book, of course, but why this is a topic that should interest you? Like, what is your I guess pitch is a way of putting it to the viewer of why they should not only read your book, but why the subject matter is something that they should learn about?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know that there's a why you should read the book, other than if you are somebody who is curious about how people mix and match their religious and cultural backgrounds and identities. I think that the book, although the book, of course, is about a particular case of JewBus, it's actually about a larger issue of how religions come together and they adapt and they change. And so I think anybody who's interested in understanding those processes of adaptation and change would be interested in the book. Right? And to me, this kind of the surprising story here is this relationship had this much older history, and that was really fun to unearth, and that this story itself is a story about how two religions came together and transformed each other. And I think that's I think it's a great contemporary story, because I think a lot of times when people are fearful of encounter and fearful of change,
Mm.
and are fearful that change is going to necessarily bring about dilution, pollution, impurity, something negative.
Right.
And not to say that this book had a judgment call about whether the change was good or bad,
Mhm.
but it just showed how the change, what it meant to the people who were who were Jewish Buddhists, and and how they saw that encounter, and how they experienced the mixing of those traditions. And I think this is the story speaks to anybody who's interested in the story of encounter and cultural change.
So now is the $1,000,000 question for anyone who wants to purchase your book or learn more about your work. Where are the places where people can find you, can talk to you, so on and so forth? Where can people find the book?
Okay, that's a good question. Where can you find the book? I don't really, I don't want to give a pitch to one particular bookseller or Amazon. It is, of course, available on Amazon and on Barnes and Noble and on all the big shop places. But it is also, the book can be purchased, I'm sure, through various other independent book houses as well, which I think would be lovely to support. But if you Google it, the name will pop up, and it'll pop up with a number of different option and purchasing options. So I hope that the viewers can easily find it, and if not, then they can contact me directly. I'd be happy to help them secure a book. And you can contact me through my Gmail. It's just my first name, last name, Emily Sigalow @gmail.com.
Fantastic. So, Emily, I want to thank you so much for speaking with us today, talking about not only your book, but a lot of the various themes and ideas that your book provokes and brings into question, which is a wonderful thing to always do in life, is read something that makes you think. To everyone out there, I, of course, hope you stay safe and stay healthy. Emily, thank you so much for taking the time with us today, and please go out there and look up the book. You'll learn a lot.
Thanks so much, Dustin. It was really a pleasure.
Absolutely. Have a wonderful rest of the day.
You too.